introduce our witness this afternoon, a brief word about the committee and the inquiry that we are currently undertaking. The Committee on Standards in Public Life was established in 1994 by the then Prime Minister, Sir John Major, to advise the Prime Minister on arrangements for upholding ethical standards of conduct across public life. The committee then, under Lord Nolan, first articulated the 7 principles of public life: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership, which set out universal standards for conduct in public life, and we as a committee continue to own and promote these principles. We're not a regulator. We do not field complaints or comment on the outcome of individual cases, but we do advise the Prime Minister and the government of the day on the processes, procedures, and regulation in place to uphold high standards of conduct, and also promote best practice on maintaining high standards within public sector organisations. In 2019, the 25th anniversary of the committee, we took a step back and commissioned some academic research mapping the complex tapestry of standards bodies that has emerged over the last 25 years. Following that, we decided to launch a review analysing the strengths and weaknesses of our current standards arrangements. The committee has done this twice before, most recently in 2013 with our Standards Matter report. And we will be taking an overall look at how well ethical standards are upheld in public life, looking at potential gaps and weaknesses, and we will also be producing some best practice guidance. We're very pleased to have the opportunity this afternoon to hear from William Wragg, MP, who is the current chair of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. And in his role, he oversees many of the institutions and bodies that regulate standards in government. From the committee side, we have this afternoon Dame Shirley Pearce, Dr. Jane Martin, who are independent members, and also Lord Stunnell, who is a political member representing the Liberal Democrat Party. We are live streaming this session on the committee's YouTube channel, and I would remind all watching that the committee is not asking about any recent or past cases, and we are carefully avoiding any existing legislation on areas adjacent to the inquiry that we're undertaking. William Wragg, thank you very much for being with us and welcome.
Thank you very much, Lord Evans. A pleasure to be with you.
Could I just start then by saying, with a more general question, which is that we have seen in recent times a certain amount of public concern and public comment on standards matters relating to the Ministerial Code, public appointments, special advisors, business appointments, and so on. Do you think that there is a particular reason why there appears to have been over the last year or two quite a lot of public comment on these standards issues?
Well, I think in answering that question, it's important to set the scene, which perhaps explains why there is increased interest in this area. And I think it's important to remember the sort of turbulent political times which we have lived through. And frankly, the very divided nature of politics and of public life more generally. Of course, I predominantly refer to the referendum on European Union membership, but I could also point to the referendum on Scottish independence, and indeed currently the very fraught times of the COVID pandemic. So I think that sets a backdrop at which suspicions and tensions perhaps are higher than they were in normal times, if I can be forgiven for not defining what normal times are. But I think more specifically, there is an issue around the admission of failure or the taking responsibility and somehow equating that for a defeat. And that then has the follow-on effect that it is a highly politicized environment, so that questions of standards are seen within that context of falling into a sort of party political a football match upon them. And so there seems to perhaps be sometimes a sense of it is best to dig in and to rough it out, as it were, rather than do what is actually a much more human thing, and perhaps to be more forthcoming and on the admission of mistakes and errors. And I think because of that, there is all of that, the context and specific sort of human behaviors, there is an increased suspicion by some, which is sometimes driven by a predisposition or view of an individual, and some individuals, of course, which we're not going to touch upon, but some of them don't exactly, people don't have mute reactions to them, do they? So I think, given all that, there's a greater intensity and a greater scrutiny to those issues.
I mean, it's a very interesting point that you make or allude to, which is, of course, no party has, the exclusive moral high ground on any of this, and no individual has the exclusive moral high ground. But do you think there is any practical way in which one can stop standards issues being a political football? And indeed, would it be right to try to do so, given that does provide a degree of accountability?
I think the straightforward answer is no. I think that ideal world, which I try to paint in the picture, probably never existed, and nor is likely to exist in the future. But it was I said it in means of painting the context as to why these issues can be so vexed.
And to what extent, obviously, I'm always slightly sceptical about references to crisis, but I don't think anyone could dispute that there's been crisis over the last 18 months. Does that in any sense excuse a lesser focus on standards issues in public life?
No, it doesn't excuse. I think it helps explain, and the two are very different, and I would always draw that distinction.
In the work that your committee oversees, how important do you think the 7 principles of public life are to the proper functioning of our democracy?
I think they're as relevant as they were in 1995. Who could possibly argue with any of them? What is key is the application to the individual, and how individuals feel that they're inculcated within them, and how they choose, or seek to demonstrate them. Of course, there's always going to be human frailty and failure to live up to those lofty ideals, but I think they have as great a relevance now as they did then. I wonder, I might proffer perhaps one more that might be added, which I think has been commented on by others, so I can't say this is a unique perspective I'm giving, but were they to the word respect may be one that's missing, although of course you can read into that in a number of them, really, but I think in the current sort of public discourse, that might be the one that's absent.
That's interesting, because as a committee we have considered whether they need recasting as public attitudes move on. The argument in favour is that many of the issues that we are confronted with today in terms of bullying and harassment and so on actually have a behavioural aspect and are about respect in one way or another, and of course that's also reflected in the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. The counter argument is that these have been established principles for 25 years. They are quite widely recognised. They've filtered through into the whole of the sort of public life of the country, and therefore changing them might be risky and counterproductive. But I don't know whether you have I feel on this myself, but I'd be really interested to know what you think.
Yes, and I think there's a great deal of sense in that. I mean, I would equate having integrity, shows that you show respect to others. I would have assumed, and so it just a thought. If you were minded to do so, that would be one that I might suggest. But equally, I don't think there's a pressing need for a complete overhaul.
No. The tapestry that I referred to in my opening remarks, we have a wide variety of regulatory bodies of one sort or another in Parliament and in government and much more widely than that in public life, some of which have higher degrees of independence, some of which have statutory backing, some of which don't, and some of which are very much within the gift of ministers and some of which are less so. Do you think that diversity of approaches and bodies is the right way to approach the standards challenge? Or would we be better either to go for a more centralized system or at least for a more consistent approach? Or is it better to let, 1,000 flowers bloom?
Well, as a sort of Burkean conservative, a sort of constitutional approach of the sort of tapestry has its natural appeal to me. I wouldn't favour a centralised approach. I think what you touch on, though, in terms of greater consistency, would be the way to go. But you want to look at each of them, their individual remits and purposes, because a one size fits all, it's almost like a moral arbiter, a sort of priestly caste who would enforce that essentially would seem slightly out of keeping with where we are at the moment, and indeed not to say an overreaction, but I would say would be disproportionate.
The other thing that we have noticed is that a number of issues in the last couple of years come before the courts, which would previously have been seen as more either constitutional or standards issues. Particularly most recently on what would have been seen as standards issues. Do you think that's something to be welcomed, something that's of concern, or does it suggest that the standards architecture is not up to scratch?
It depends upon what the issue is at hand, doesn't it? If it's a criminal matter, then of course it's a matter for the courts in terms of any standards issue. But in terms of what can be properly dealt with by existing structures, then I think that best remain. I think it's probably more a reflection of some perhaps egregious or indeed criminal matters.
I guess the other sort of reflection that we have is that there has been increasing independence in some parts of the system, and particularly in Parliament, both in the Commons and the Lords. The adjudication of standards issues has moved in a direction of much greater independence at some pace, given the fact that Parliament isn't always noted for its rapid evolution. That hasn't reached some other parts of the system, particularly on the ministerial side. And we're going to come on to the ministerial code, but as a general approach, how far do you think that independence and not sitting in judgment on yourself, as it were, is a desirable characteristic?
I think you're right to highlight the speed at which Parliament has moved, indeed countering any sense that it lags behind. I think if you're going to do that comparison, then clearly it is wider Whitehall that has lagged behind. But it is still important to note the distinction. MPs aren't line managed as such. For example, it's equally like the minister, it doesn't come with much of a job description, and I'm sure Lord Stunhall would attest to that. But I think certainly Parliament has set a pace, but I would suggest that whatever is required in addition to what we have already in the wider world of Whitehall, that it should be appropriate to the need. It need not exactly mirror what Parliament has chosen to pursue.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Dr. Martin to talk about the ministerial code.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Wragg. On the ministerial code, I've got a number of questions just to sort of try to tease out from you what you think is working well and what might need to be changed. But perhaps I could just start with the sort of most general question, which is, really, are the current arrangements successful broadly? And is in fact a code of conduct the right way to regulate ministers' behaviour, and ethical standards? There's a lot been said about different ways in which it might be amended, but really like to hear your view.
the code is necessary. The question is whether it should be the combination of two aspects, either a code and standards and the sort of how to do the job of being a minister. I think there's two options I'd suggest. Either you completely separate them as separate documents, or else you just make the distinction absolutely clear within the one document. But I don't think it's particularly helpful to have it mashed together, as it were, at the moment.
Is that just from the point of view of sort of confusion, or does it go to how the public understand this, or how ministers understand the arrangement?
Well, I think there is an element of confusion, but I think it would also make it much clearer for both the sort of casual lay observer public, but also for the minister themselves. Quite often in discussions of this in public forum, the sort of agency of the minister seems to be forgotten about to an extent. That it is for them to live out, though, if we go back to the previous question, to live out those 7 principles, and for them to be mindful of it, and therefore having it distinct would I think make it easier for them to be mindful of it.
Sure, but there are different codes of conduct, of course, aren't there? I mean, across Parliament, Commons, Lords, and then for ministers. Do you think that the proliferation of codes, or perhaps the inconsistencies in the codes, is that a problem, or not really?
Well, I don't think it is a problem. I think that they're all going to be roughly aiming for the same thing, aren't they? To inculcate good standards of conduct. I think the reason that they're separate is a fundamental constitutional one. Parliament in itself, the territorial nature of both houses doing things in a way that they wish to do is right and proper, and likewise a separation of that from the role of ministers as distinct from members of Parliament, although of course they do cross over.
Okay, thank you. And one of the issues that gets talked about a lot in relation to the Ministerial Code is the way in which ministerial conduct is regulated, and the greater independence from the Prime Minister. I mean, we understand, of course, the constitutional context here, but and at a number of points throughout the process, which I'm sure you're fully aware of, the Prime Minister initiates investigations, etc., throughout to says when reports should be published, and indeed whether he then takes on board the conclusions of the independent advisor or not. But all those points are points at which the Prime Minister, of course, has the final authority. Should there be any changes to that? Would greater independence be a good thing?
I think the Prime Minister should have the final authority on it. But I think it might be interesting, and in saying this, I'm reflecting a discussion that I've had with members of my committee before today's session. And a suggestion might be that such a inquiry might be at the request of the Cabinet Secretary, for example. It might not solely rely upon the initiation from the Prime Minister. But in terms of the final aspect, then yes, I think that certainly should remain with the Prime Minister. But that would lead me then on. I wouldn't want to preempt any further questions. That would lead on to the nature of that sanction.
So I understand. So let's go on to sanctions then. So at the moment, the Convention dictates that this any breach of the code is a resignation matter. Would you agree with a more graduated range of sanctions?
Yes, I would, is the short answer. I think that we, for better or worse, we don't live in an age of, the Lord Carrington style resignations, do we? There have been some resignations that might have mirrored that, but I think that's quite a famous example. And I think the lack of a grade of sanction actually makes any sanction less likely, because of the severity of it being either dismissal or demand of resignation. And that, I would proffer the opinion, has been why, without going into specifics, why there is a perception of it being a rather toothless approach.
So you seem quite clear that a graduated approach, it would be a good idea, because we'd be more likely to see, my words not yours, something being done.
Yes, yeah, I think that's fair to say, and I think if we're going to, hold ourselves up, or ministers are going to hold themselves up, then I think it's only fair that the sanction should also mirror what there is in other areas of society and in work life. Having yellow card systems, or having different grade, that is typical across the board elsewhere.
I see. And I mean, so things like maybe the advisor advising on recommending lesser sanctions. I mean, would that graduation go so far as to who makes the final authority? I mean, could a breach of the ministerial code, lead to an offer of resignation on behalf of the Prime Minister, and the PM has the discretion to accept or reject it?
Yes.
And similarly, although a different point, could lesser sanctions to the Prime Minister be made by the advisor? I mean, would that all go with a mix?
Well, that would be what would need to be considered. And if I'm to not give a specific answer to that yet, it's because I haven't properly thought about it. But I think that is an important point. Is it going to be a recommendation? Who is going to recommend the level of sanction? Is that a matter for the Prime Minister? Otherwise, you could get back exactly to square one as well. So it's actually developing a fair and robust system that recognises that it is the Prime Minister who is accountable ultimately in the cabinet system, and that therefore he or she should have that ultimate discretion. But I think having a raft of, or not a raft, but however many of gradated sanctions will be more helpful.
I see, thank you. And finally from me, on the point about accountability for the ministerial code. So PACAC has in the past recommended the laying of the ministerial code before Parliament, i.e. greater oversight by Parliament of the ministerial code in that way, or indeed by your committee. Would you support those kind of moves?
I'm always in favour of my committee having greater prominence, but I would not be too fussed if we did not. Now, I realise that in the previous session you've had my predecessor, Sir Bernard Jenkin, and as much as I am loath to disagree with him at all, I am not particularly precious on that suggestion.
I see. Okay, thank you very much. Those are my questions. I think Dame Shirley has some questions now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Can we turn to the oversight regulation of business appointments? I wondered what you think about the powers and position sanctions available to ACABA. I know that Lord Pickles has recently written to you about the way he's going to strengthen the committee's approach largely through transparency, but I'm keen to get a sense of what you think about the powers that they have and how it should be, if it should be strengthened, and how they should be.
Yes, and I think I welcome what Lord Pickles has proposed within the very narrow room for manoeuvre that he has, given the non-statutory nature of ACABA. And so drawing from my committee's, or the predecessor committee's, recommendation of at least a cost-benefit analysis to see what the material difference would be in having ACABA statutorily underpinned, and rather than its stern letters and everything else, if it had the power of enforcement, I think it would be very interesting to see how many appointments were taken up by individuals, both former senior civil servants and former ministers against the advice, and to have that properly done as a cost-benefit analysis to know what the effect of a statutory underpinning would be. It certainly, I think it needs, there's a strong argument for having more powers, also a strong argument for having a greater remit beyond what it does currently, of simply the very most senior civil servants. More junior civil servants, of course, it's the permanent secretaries in those departments who have the responsibility of vetting. But I think that there is a concern that lower down the ladder, as it were, of seniority, there is still perhaps there is something perturbing going on there. So I would support that increased range of operation for ACABA.
So you'd put it all together. And when you say perturbing going on, can you just elaborate on that a bit?
Well, there's always going to be a need, I'd suggest, for flexibility of people moving from the private sector into the public sector and vice versa. That is what makes for successful and healthy organisations, whether it's a public sector body or a private sector body. There's nothing wrong, with that. That is to be encouraged. And so, you are going to have, if you wish to encourage that, you're going to have the means for that to happen. It's just as ever important that people aren't using, information that is particular, restricted to what, or contacts or so on and so forth. It's fine if they're using the skills that they've acquired and developed in whatever role in public or in public service going into private sector. But I think as long as it is clear that there is no, everything is done rather to prevent, improper appointments which are benefiting an individual on the basis of the information that they've acquired and how that might be useful for a private sector entity. But I think what you want to do is just have a system that allows for that. That's why I think the greater range that ACABA can look at would address any of those issues.
Okay, and in your thoughts about increasing the powers and the notion of possibly a statutory basis, are there what are the pros and cons of that statutory position?
Well, the pros are that you would have absolute complete assurance that, well, as sure as you could be really, because ACABA itself might not be completely infallible, perish the thought, but insofar as it is possible, you'd have an absolute assurance of propriety. Okay. The only other consideration against that, not necessarily in conflict with, but against the suggestion, is that it would discourage that necessary movement to and fro and maybe put people off. But I think that is probably a lesser consideration than is to secure absolute propriety.
And it would put people off because of the hassle they've got to go through, or
not necessarily the hassle, but I think particularly sometimes public scrutiny isn't always as objective as it might be. It can at times, and for private citizen, frankly, is it going to be, do they wish to be put through a greater level of public scrutiny than they'd been previously used to, coming into a role? But as I say, that should be always a much lesser consideration than the need to ensure propriety.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. Can we move on to public appointments? And I wanted to get a sense of whether you share some of the concerns of the Public Appointments Commissioner about the balance between making appointments on merit and objectivity versus ministerial control.
Well, I think it goes back to a question: did the Grimstone review move things too far the other way from where it was before? That I think that might be sort of the basis of the question. I think there should always be ministerial discretion in appointment, as long as they have a choice of a list of appointable candidates, others who in themselves would be eminently qualified and appropriate for the role. I think the focus of criticism at the moment has come in terms of the makeup of those interview or selection panels. If they seem, how can I put it, more favourable for a certain outcome than otherwise they might, I think that is perhaps where current concern is mainly focused.
So should there be greater powers to stop that happening? What would that look like?
Well, the commissioner's gone to the role of regulator, haven't they? So they are no longer invested with the power to make such an intervention. But of course, that is a consequence of the Grimstone review largely. So it's whether we go back to the system as it was before. And
I'm sort of trying to get a sense of what you think. What your advice to anybody looking at this would be?
My advice would be to the issue is the interview selection panels, and if the commissioner were to think it appropriate to seek powers of intervention at that stage, I think that would be the stage at which intervention would be justified. I think it's perfectly appropriate for the minister to have final say-so of appointment from a list of appointable candidates. But I think in terms of how you get to that list, or how a particular person comes into being the preferred candidate, I think that's the point at which intervention might be necessary.
Okay. And of course, what we're doing at the moment is talking about regulated appointments. What about unregulated appointments? What's your thoughts about that and the risks associated with them?
Well, I think there are a good many, aren't there? Because of course the commissioner tends to oversee the appointment of those people who are going to oversee things. You know, he oversees chairs rather than the oversight, people with responsibility for that, rather than executive and day-to-day issues. Of course, it's very interesting when you get an executive chair, and that's classed, of course, outside the remit. And obviously, there have been a number of examples recently, as a pandemic-related appointments, and I'd note on that the former cabinet secretary said to our committee when he was in post that was a sort of temporary response reflecting the urgency of a situation and not a precedent for future appointments. And so the key thing in that is it's not a precedent for future appointments. So perhaps it's a little too early to see, but certainly if that continued, if that precedent was to become a precedent and continue, then clearly the remit and role of the commissioner would need re-examining, in my view.
Okay, and do you have an idea of how long you'd expect that period of review to be, when we should start getting?
Well, frankly, I think it's been and gone, because I think the argument was that those appointments were made urgently and of necessity, and I think that moment has passed now. So I wouldn't expect to see any more.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to Lord Evans now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shirley. When we were talking to Sir Bernard Jenkin, he outlined a very interesting area, I think, which was that ultimately the upholding of public standards really is something that should be growing from those who are in the roles rather than being imposed on them by external regulators, and that in a sense the proliferation of regulators and standards bodies almost gives people the ability to say, oh, well, that's a matter for the oversight, and I'll do everything that falls short of coming into difficulty with the overseers. And he was saying that he feels that there needs to be more opportunity for reflective learning on standards issues, which he does then require, as it were, a safe space in which to do that. And I think this is a very interesting area, because I think, in most organizations, that ability to learn from mistakes, to reflect on one's own values and so on, is something which is very important and seen as being a very key element of personal development, but perhaps not so easy to do in some parts of government, and particularly in political life, where the environment is not particularly conducive to admitting to weakness. Is this an area that you or your committee have given much thought to? Because one of the things we would like to do is to be able to point out areas of best practice, as well as make any recommendations that we think are necessary in terms of detailed processes.
It certainly is, and I think just one example of that is, what is the role and how does one how does one go about being a minister? Okay, it sounds a really obvious thing, but there is, people are appointed. Sometimes people are appointed for very different reasons. Of course, they're always appointed on merit. I'm entirely convinced of that. But if sometimes the ministers will come from a range of backgrounds, have a range of experiences, and so what is the support and personal development opportunities afforded to them as ministers? And sometimes I suspect, if ministers had the confidence to ask questions sooner, to be open about areas of which they were not experts but needed guidance, or were concerned by certain things, I think that sort of early identification of issues would take away the risk of those developing into well, let's be frank, dysfunctionality, and very difficult situations and scenarios. Because yes, it is a it has its unique pressure. There's a unique pressure to it, and so what opportunities and support, and I don't mean that in a condescending way at all, what is provided to the minister so that they can grow into the role and have the confidence to fulfill it as best they can. I think that's an important consideration, and we have touched on that in various sessions of the committee, because what we've had really sort of general discourse is, politicians often talk about how we're going to reform the civil service. Well, how are we going to reform ministers? How are we going to reform sort of the art of government, to put it loftily? And I think those are key concerns, and that requires reflection. And I think Sir Bernard Jenkin is spot on in what he says on that.
Is there sufficient induction? Is there sufficient induction into Parliament on these sort of issues? I know there is now some, because we were very kindly invited to come and talk about standards for 12 minutes or something on the first day. Well, that's 12 minutes more than there was last time. Yeah. But it doesn't seem to be an environment which actively encourages learning in those more reflective and formal ways, as opposed to learning on the job.
I think you're absolutely correct. Well, that was 12 minutes more than I received in 2015. I can tell you that. So they're doing very well. I think you're absolutely right. It is unique pressures, unique expectations, and at the end of the day, we all have our own frailties and weaknesses. We're not superhuman. And so, frankly, it doesn't surprise me when there are, situations that have arisen or arise. And I think actually having, first of all, to acknowledge that is the key thing, to acknowledge that. And then I think it's a work in progress as to how you best support. But I think that's, nobody is ever going to get the violins out for the politicians, and nor should we expect or wish them to do so. But ultimately, if we ourselves aren't prepared to speak up for ourselves, I don't know who is.
Thank you very much. We've touched on a number of areas that are particular, we know are of particular interest to us. We're obviously looking right across the piece. Are there other areas that you would recommend that we should look at? Or other observations that you would like to make that might, kind of lead us in the right direction for the continuing review?
Yes, I just sort of reiterate that the difference between excusing and explaining. There's no excuse for poor conduct in public office, no excuse whatsoever. But there is quite often an explanation. And it's the understanding of the explanation that can prevent it happening more widely or again. And I've used this in a different context before, but there's the sort of Gerald Ratner approach to all of these matters. Obviously, famously said that his jewelry was rubbish, or a word stronger than that, and was surprised that his customers bought it. And lo and behold, once he said that, they stopped buying it. And so if we say that everything's in a state of wreck and ruination, then people will believe that. I don't think we're quite in a state of wreck and ruination. There are clearly matters to be addressed. But if I might end on a positive, I do think in terms of developed democracies, and of course having a disputatious press as well, there is actually grounds for greater optimism than sometimes might be apparent.
That's extremely helpful, and I think you're completely correct in saying that we need to keep a sense of perspective over some of these issues. Not to say that we don't want very high standards, but I was at a seminar at the end of last year, the year before, discussing the breakdown of trust in British society, and we had a very distinguished former diplomat present who pointed out that if you think there are issues with the way in which public life is run in this country, you haven't gone and travelled very widely in large parts of the world. Nevertheless, of course, our joint endeavour is to ensure that that continues to be the case, and that people do feel that they are expected to live up to high standards. But I also agree with you that that also means recognising where good standards are in fact in place. And one of the things that I took from the conversation this morning that we had with Sir Alex Allen and Sir Philip Moore was their comment, and they of course are closer perhaps to ministerial behaviour than most of us, that their general experience was that most ministers are very keen and enthusiastic and want to do the right thing and take advice and take their responsibilities seriously. So that is an important corrective, and I agree with that. But we are most grateful for your time today. Thank you very much for the evidence that you've given. We will continue to pay close attention to the work that your committee is doing on adjacent areas. And thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Evans,
Thank you.
and thank you to the panel.